Okay, let's go ahead and get started. Thank you for joining today, TopStep's monthly webinar series. Today's topic will be best practices and tips and tricks working with OpenAir and NetSuite in an integrated environment. And my name is Ron Bro. I'm President and CEO of TopStep, and I'm excited to be able to present this material today. So for today's session, there are some key topics we want to dig into a little bit and talk about when it comes to using OpenAir and NetSuite. So we want to talk about how to connect the systems and best practices to do so. We also want to talk about how to get the systems communicating on a scheduled basis. And then there's some other features that have been released, some additional features that have been released over the years that we'd like to highlight to make sure that if these are releases you may benefit from or items you may benefit from, that you have full information about those. So we'll talk about some of those key features. And then we'll end with some of the useful switches that we see with regards to getting this system set up and integrated. Okay, token-based authentication. So this is a very important setup process when you're integrating OpenAir and NetSuite. The key to this is you no longer have to worry about password expirations. We've been doing this a long time, and prior to this, anytime my NetSuite password changed, it required a rework of the integration to put in a new password. So this token-based authentication does allow you to avoid that in the future. And so when you're setting up the token-based authentication in NetSuite, if you make sure you set it so that it's do not check the user authentication, then it will ignore the user credentials, if there are any, and it will just use the token. If you're looking to hide the user credentials inside of OpenAir and the integration, there's a new switch that came out in one of the past releases that allow you to set the TVA exclusively, and which then removes the email and the password fields on the OpenAir integration page. And then in addition to the token based, you have to create a token record and then sync that to a NetSuite integration user and the NSOA connector role, which we'll talk about in the next slide. So the NSOA connector role is a role that gets automatically created when you install the NetSuite integration bundle 2851. This basically role was set to be able to facilitate the share of information between OpenAir. However, when this role gets created, there are some missing permissions that you need to check to make sure that the role is fully enabled to support the integration. For example, make sure that you're set to log in using access tokens to full, and make sure all the other access tokens are set. Make sure that if you're using a multi-currency OneWorld account, you need to make sure that this role has access to all subsidiaries as well as all currencies. It will default invoicing to view only, and you need it to be set to full. And then web services also needs to be can be set to view as well. So this allows the integration to use this role and be able to function as expected. Inside of NetSuite, we do require a user. We recommend a NetSuite integration user be set up rather than using a employee user record. It does burn a license for the integration, but it is what we consider best practice here. And it does allow you now to be able to turn off and on employees as employees come and go without being concerned about whose integration is tied to, whose user is tied to the integration record. We also would obviously, this role of this user will be that new NSOA connector role. And user also will then be tied to create the token record in NetSuite. When you're setting up the integration, you have to associate that token to a user. And obviously this will be the user to do that with, and that is what fully enables the integration between the two systems. So scheduling the integration, currently today, there is a limitation on the number of times you can schedule the integration within a 24-hour period, and that number of time is 12. You can set it to run as often as you like, as long as you don't exceed the limit. If you try to exceed the limit, you will get an error. Generally, we recommend it to run, every other hour within an integrated environment as needed. We have some customers that only run it once a day, some customers that run it multiple times a day, and then at night they'll pick up a nightly run to pick up any activity after hours. I'm sure you're all aware, all the time zones in the integration are set to Eastern. So if you are an international or if you're in Pacific time, you'll need to translate those Eastern times to your local time zone to make sure you schedule the integration to run appropriately. And obviously when the integration runs, it will then generate those logs that you will get. And then there's the logs that are full integration logs. And then there's the option to also have just the error log delivered to you each time the integration runs. There's also the ability to do real-time integration. So a lot of customers of ours say we want certain data elements not to have to wait for the integration to run. So we can go in then and set up some of the real-time. For example, we want, as soon as an invoice is approved, we want it to be able to then automatically export directly into NetSuite without the needing for the integration to run. So that's certainly a popular real-time integration option. There's some setup and enablement that needs to happen inside of OpenAir for this to happen. And then there's a NetSuite real-time bundle that needs to be installed inside of NetSuite to help facilitate the real-time connection. And this real-time connection can be both bi-directional as well. So we can have potentially customers or projects originating in NetSuite go directly to OpenAir without needing a full run of the integration, and vice versa. So this can be very helpful for folks that are looking for real-time data exchange between their two systems. And generally, the trigger for this triggering the real-time is generally either an approval or on a save, depending on the type of record it is in OpenAir. For customers and projects would be on save versus invoicing or expense reports would be on approval. So in the old days, not that long ago, in order to do a full sync of data elements, you would turn off the chapter, save the integration, turn back on the chapter, save the integration, and then do a run. And it would automatically resync all the records. For those of you not aware, currently records are only synced if there's been an edit, and depending on the owning system. So for example, if you are creating projects in NetSuite, pushing those projects into OpenAir, there's a one-time push. And if the project is edited in NetSuite because you change the value, then that project will then resync as long as there's an edit in the UI. Sometimes customers will want to do a bulk edit through an integration or through an upload of values to either a new field or changing values to existing fields. And those edits mostly will not trigger the integration. They may, depending on how you update the records. So in that scenario where maybe the record didn't trigger an update, you want to then do a full sync. The new way to do that is different. There's actually underneath the tips and tricks, if you have it enabled, this is a switch that you'll need to turn on within the administration panel to be able to run with NetSuite full sync. Now, word of caution, I would recommend turning off any chapters that you don't want fully synced. So for example, if you just want to sync projects and customers, then I would turn off all the other chapters before you run this full sync. If you want to sync all data, which is kind of common when we're doing new implementations, then you don't need to go through that exercise. But sometimes customers don't want to sync all the data together. So making sure that we turn off what we don't want to sync and making sure that we then can run this full synchronization. This is also a newer feature called validate mapping. And so in the past, a lot of times you would create some of the more complicated lookups or some of the more complicated mappings, conversions of data from one to another. And if you have a typo, sometimes the integration would error out, and sometimes, and more often than not, it would not error out. And so then you run your integration not realizing that you had an error and now trying to scratch your head to say, why is it not working? And some of the is very minute. Some of the ways you set these up can be very hard to identify where there might be an error. So with this validate mapping link enabled, you then can basically set up your integration inside of OpenAir and then be able to click on this validate mapping. And that will basically allow you to run through all your code inside the mappings, and then it will throw any errors that the save may have not caught. And so this is really helpful to validate any potential errors you might have made and help you identify those before you get into running the full integration. So we would highly recommend, and that is also another switch that needs to be enabled. It's not part of the standard integration. So we do recommend this as a part of making sure you've got everything synced up correctly. Speaking of one world integrations, a commonality there is currency and currency foreign exchange rates. In OpenAir and NetSuite integrated environment, it's really important that the exchange rates between the two systems are synced together. So in that case, you can enable foreign exchange rates for multi-currency to be nightly synced. It's recommended that this run early in the morning, 3-4 a.m. Eastern time. It needs to be turned on in both OpenAir and NetSuite. And then within the NetSuite administration panel where it can be enabled and scheduled. And so this is a key element for if you're looking to report on invoice values and foreign currency exchanges, to compare those to OpenAir foreign currency exchanges and being able to compare apples to apples between the systems so that they share the same rate. It is a snapshot of whatever the rate is at the time. So it is not updating previous runs. So each day it runs, it stores the rates in the table, it updates the next rate if it's changed, but it is not going back to previous days each time it runs. So just be aware of that. We often get asked about how to handle taxation inside of OpenAir, and there's a few taxation slides we'll talk about. One being invoices. We're finding more and more service organizations are being required to tax their services depending on the state they do business in. And so in those scenarios, we enable the tax import process for our customers. Now, what that looks like is, when OpenAir generates an invoice that's potentially taxable, it then and that invoice is then approved either automatically or through approval process, and then pushed to NetSuite. What happens is NetSuite tax engine is where the magic happens. Determine whether you're using NetSuite's engine or a partner. It calculates the tax based on the combination of the service, the location, the customer, and then it will decide whether a tax is due or not, and it will stamp the tax on the invoice. There is scripts that the bundle installs in NetSuite to copy that tax to a field that then gets sent immediately back to the invoice. So the invoice in OpenAir will not have a tax. It will get exported, and through the export process, the tax will be immediately written back to OpenAir. And so you may want to ask, why do I need the tax in OpenAir? And there's 2 points. One, obviously you want OpenAir Invoice to mimic NetSuite Invoice if a customer has a question for PS. Secondly, when you're applying payments in NetSuite and pushing those payments to OpenAir, you do want the full invoice value to be shown in OpenAir so that those payments apply correctly. So there's a few settings that have to be set. It's pretty simple process to set this up. You have to make sure in NetSuite you have this set up as part of the general settings, and then in OpenAir, under the settings, there's also the import taxes applied. And once you do this going forward, it's a go forward only. It will not go back and set taxes on previous invoices if you don't have this enabled today. So just an FYI. Credit memos. We often have long conversations with customers about the best way to attack credit memos between OpenAir and NetSuite. And what I tell customers is there are two general thoughts around how and when to do this. There is now bi-directional credit memo capabilities in the system. So most of you will be aware there was a feature released a couple years ago called Credit Rebill in OpenAir, where you could actually credit an invoice and then do a rebill either at that point or in a future state, depending on the reason for the rebill. And so it works really well, but it does do a couple of things that you need to be aware of. It's a good, using the credit feature in OpenAir and a rebill, it might sound silly, but it's really only recommended if you actually need the rebill. For example, I billed $50,000 to my customer. I should have only billed 25. The other 25 was not due yet. So I need to credit the 50,000. I need to rebill 25 now and then rebill 25 later. So in that scenario, that would be a great use of a credit rebill in OpenAir. When you create the original 50,000, obviously that invoice would have flowed into NetSuite. When you rebill, when you do a credit, it's in OpenAir, it will credit the entire $50,000. And so it will create a reversing invoice. And then that will actually export to NetSuite to create a credit memo for that $50,000. So in theory, you have a zero value AR incident for that. And then when you rebill at a later date, then obviously you're creating net new invoices in NetSuite. So creating those credit rebills in OpenAir, needing to rebill at a later state is really, and this works well for also if you've got, if you're doing T&M billing and you maybe billed the wrong rate to a customer and you need to redo the invoice. If you are just applying a credit because a customer was grumpy and you decided to give them some sort of a credit, then we recommend that be done in NetSuite. So for example, in our example, $50,000 invoice, customer disputes something or decides they're not happy, you decide to give them a $10,000 credit. That would be something you would want to do in NetSuite because you can do that partial credit. It's not anything you would future rebill. So in that scenario, you would apply the credit to the NetSuite original invoice. That would then push back to OpenAir and resync and give you the ability to have correct reporting in both systems. So both are available. It's important to understand when to use which, and hopefully this will be helpful in making that determination. Going back to taxes, another tax feature we find often customers are looking for is tracking taxes on expense reports. Generally, this is specific to VAT or VAT. And for those most of you aware, if I travel to the UK and I incur VAT on my expenses, and the customer needs to be able to report the amount of VAT incurred so they can get reimbursed by the government, the user needs to be able to report the VAT as well. And so OpenAir does have the ability to handle this, and it does work between an integrated environment. There's a few setups that need to happen. First, you need to enable the tax options inside of OpenAir. OpenAir does have a tax engine. It's a very light engine, but it does work, especially for tracking VAT on expense reports. So you integrate create your tax engine in OpenAir, set up your tax locations, enable those tax locations on the receipts. And then in the integration, you would go ahead and enable the tax export on the expense reports. So if I create an expense report in OpenAir and I determine there was a 10% VAT on my expense receipt, the VAT gets tracked separately. When that invoice exports, it will create an expense line on my expense report in NetSuite that will track the VAT as a separate column and a separate amount inside of NetSuite, which then allows customers to be able to report on the amount of VAT incurred across expense reports for their employees. So that's a pretty, it's a common element, especially in international deployments. And so it's a feature that is not commonly used, but is very powerful and can be very helpful. Project templates. This is really applicable if you're creating projects inside of NetSuite direct, either manually or through a script inside of NetSuite. If you're using NetSuite CRM, automatically creating projects, you may want to have the project when it's created in OpenAir to generate from a template. So in that scenario, you can actually create templates in OpenAir and then have those templates created. And you're not actually creating a template in NetSuite, you're just adding a pick list with the template names. And then you can auto check the create new projects. You can, in the integration, make sure new projects are based on the template. So basically this allows you to auto create projects in OpenAir, and you can, similar to creating a project from a project in OpenAir, you can copy billing rules, or revenue rules, expense policies, etc., project approvers from the template. So very helpful for those customers that are attempting to create those projects from NetSuite and want to be able to benefit from the use of templates. So troubleshooting, couple of things. Obviously, if you're receiving those error reports, and there's sometimes going to be errors there that you need to go in and decode, and sometimes it's very easy to decode those errors. Sometimes it takes a little more investigation to figure out what those are. So in the last release, potentially, I know it was a release in 2019, they released a new status link inside of OpenAir. This was a great add to give you the ability to see the integration and all of the data that was handled and any errors that were happening, not only in the most recent run, but also across past runs. And you can see the data a few ways and be able to drill into it. So it's very helpful. It gives you a little more streamlined error logging with a little clearer instructions as to why the error has occurred. So I think the status feature is great to add as they continue to improve this integration. Oftentimes, though, even me will get stumped by the error, and because it's very vanilla and it doesn't really tell us, and everything looks correct, there's nothing obvious. And in those scenarios, generally we will escalate to OpenAir support, and inevitably they'll ask us to give them a copy of the web service usage log. So this is a log that gets tracked in NetSuite. So anytime an integration is run, there's a web service log that's created for every element that is part of that integration. And it allows you to go in and be able to pull the log. And so we can say, show me all of the invoicing logs that happen within a 24-hour period, and then be able to provide those web service logs to NetSuite support. And then from there, they have the ability to drill even deeper. And it even helps us sometimes before we'll go to support, we'll run those logs and see in NetSuite if there's a clearer answer to the problem of what the error was. And so sometimes even just looking at those web service logs in NetSuite can be very helpful. So assuming you have access to NetSuite, having those web service logs is under the setup, integration, and SOA web-based usage log be very helpful. Oops. So some of the useful switches, some we've talked about, some we have not. So I'll highlight these and where I feel like they'll be benefit. There was not too long ago where you would inactivate a user in NetSuite and the OpenAir. At that point, there would be no further updates in OpenAir from that employee record. And so you could have an inactive user in NetSuite and then have an active user in OpenAir that someone would have to go in and manually check. So you do have the ability to update inactive users. So in that scenario, even though the user might be inactive in NetSuite, you can still have that update the user record to inactivate the user in OpenAir, and keeping the two systems in sync could be very helpful. Another switch that we use a lot is being able to bring in prospects. So especially where NetSuite customers are using a CRM as part of the NetSuite footprint. A lot of times, customers are obviously able to come in, but if you do want prospects prior to an opportunity goes close one, then you can actually turn on the switch that allows prospects to come through as long as they have the export to OpenAir checkbox. So this would create a customer in OpenAir. It would look the same as any other customer, but it would allow you to then bring in projects through early, potentially before it close one, before the NetSuite converts the prospect to a customer. We talked about mapping the OpenAir stage from the NetSuite project stage. Actually, we did not, but you can also set the project stage from NetSuite. So there's a similar feature to the template feature that allows you to set the stage from NetSuite and set the stage as in OpenAir. This could be initial only for setting new projects up, or it could be something more ongoing where project stages are managed in NetSuite for some business reason, and those then update OpenAir. The templates we talked about. Expense policy. So we find expense policy very helpful, and putting those expense policies on templates can be very useful. So being able to enable that policy duplication. This is a switch that needs to be enabled if you don't have that in your account. So you'll need to check with support if you're interested in doing so. Disabling service type filtering. What this means is that in general, the integration was built to handle service for sale or service for resale. So in NetSuite, when you set up your items and identify them as a service item, and in the market as a service for sale or a service for resale, and mark those as export to OpenAir, then those flow in, those flow in great. But if you go in and set up a non-inventory item as part of the integration, and you want that non-inventory item in OpenAir, even by checking the export to OpenAir box, it will not flow in. So this is disabling the service type filtering, because out of the box, it's only filtering for service items. And you can then disable the service type filter, and then it will send over anything where the export to OpenAir is checked. So that can be very helpful. Also newish is the ability to, instead of creating customers and projects in NetSuite and pushing them through, you can now create customers and projects in OpenAir originating and push those through to NetSuite. And this is very common and popular because project managers and PS managers want to be able to get those projects in early, start planning, and we don't want to push them into NetSuite until the opportunity goes closed one, until we're ready to start the project. So we've often be setting these projects up in early stages and using a stage as a filter event to say when the project reaches a certain stage, then it's enabled to send to NetSuite. And that helps project managers and PS managers set the projects up early. Also, if you're interested in syncing contacts, there is an export to OpenAir checkbox on contacts that you can check as part of, as long as the client is also got the export to OpenAir checkbox. But if you don't want to go through the hassle of checking it for all the contacts, there is a switch that allows you to pull all contacts that, as long as they're associated to a client, that has export to OpenAir check. So this will allow you to basically pull in everything. We talked about the enabling the strict mapping validation. This was a switch that we talked about. The full synchronization control as well. Disable invoice report, expense report and vendor bill references. So this is basically out of the box OpenAir. When they send over an expense report and then send over an invoice on that expense report, there's a syncage that happens. Sometimes that syncage can cause problematic. So this allows you to basically send the invoice over even before the expense report hits NetSuite. But you may want to make sure you test this if you're interested in it, because it does impact the GL impact of the expense report in combination with the invoice. So it's a very helpful switch, but it needs to be thoroughly vetted through before enabling. So in summary, OpenAir and NetSuite are built to integrate. So that's great news. You need to know the best options to set the data flows up and make sure you're aware of all the features that are enabled that will support a successful process and a successful integration. So I'm going to open it up. I'll start answering questions. Shameless plug for Top Step. Our PS business operations continue to grow, serving over 360 customers. Please go to our website. You can sign up for our newsletter. You can follow us on Twitter. We also are heavy in LinkedIn. So we recommend you also follow us there. And thank you, everyone, and everyone have a great day.